Good evening or afternoon in the States, and welcome to this week's Global Christian Perspectives with me, Chris Eyre, and on the other side of the Atlantic, Elgin Hushbeck. We've got a few items, not necessarily the greatest news week, apart from deaths, really, and one of those got a bit of coverage in various Christian circles, which was the death of David Bowie, who at one time was an extremely controversial figure for being gay, then for being bisexual, wearing a dress, and anarchic music. I know. You were saying, Elgin, that you were very much one for not saying ill of the dead.
Particularly around the time of their death. I'm never really happy to see anyone die, and it's to me, it's not a time to kick somebody, or to remind everything of everybody bad. I mean, we're all sinners in the eyes of God, and obviously, it's not an absolute rule with me. I didn't feel any compulsion to say anything nice about Osama bin Laden when he died, but barring the truly evil, I make it a rule that when someone passes away, that's just not the time to be going after them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is a tendency, certainly here, at least after the first flush of reports has died down, for it to be more Shakespeare's "the evil that men do lives after them, the good is oft interred with their bones," rather than the old Latin tag of "de mortuis nil nisi bonum," of the dead say nothing but good. I kind of prefer, unless I'm actually delivering a eulogy, to try to put a life in perspective after a death. And Bowie seemed to me particularly interesting from that point of view, because there are things that one might very much have disliked about his influence and what he did, but he managed to influence a couple of generations worth of musicians, and from the outpouring of tributes from people, obviously there was a huge influence there. Now, I have to say there were aspects of his persona that I rather liked. I like the fact, for instance, that he made it less of a huge social stigma to be a little different from the norm. He was a lot different from the norm. But
Anyway.
when I was growing up, anybody with any kind of vague tendency in that direction used to get pilloried unmercifully. And of course he was doing this 40 years ago, 45 years ago, so those attitudes were still quite strong. Would you see that as being a positive influence, Elgin?
Well, actually, yes and no. I mean, yes, in the sense that I think as a society, or particularly as a Christian, one of the hardest things we have to do is to try and keep a sense of balance about us. I can look back in history and I can see periods where the church was way overboard being too strict. And I can look at periods in history where, they become there is no standard. Where I think we're more towards the no standard period at the moment than the too strict at the moment. But, I don't see those as binary, black and white situations. I see them as a spectrum where we need to be somewhere in the middle. We need to have some sort of standards But on the other hand, we don't want to be, we don't want to be too judgmental, using the old version of that term as opposed to the modern incarnation of that term. But so there's a sense of balance in the sense that he allowed people to break social conventions and not be pilloried for it. That's probably a good thing. On the other hand, in the sense that he broke down social convention, where I think we've gone a little too far. So, there's a balance. I think going back to your earlier point in terms of judging a musician, that is particularly difficult because I think you have to make a distinction between their work and their life.
Yes.
And even outside of Bowie, you can go back to, for example, probably one of the more controversial musicians would be Wagner, and the fact that his music was very influential, and was popular among certain unpopular groups, particularly the Nazis, that made his music something to be rejected by many people. I don't share that, even though I would share the rejection of the anti-Semitism. I don't share that the music embodies that necessarily. So I think there's a difference to be made between a person's public life and the influence they have, and the person's private life and who they are as a person. When you have someone like an artist or musician, someone who maybe is a politician and yet a family man. There's lots of politicians on all spectrums that there's a difference between them as a person and them as their political persona, so to speak.
Yeah.
So, and that becomes very difficult to judge. And one of the reasons I'm reluctant to judge on the day of death is quite often, a lot of times these people, I haven't thought about David Bowie in decades. And so, if I'm going to say something, maybe I remember something I disliked about him, and therefore I'm going to say something bad, or maybe I'm going to say something that I like about him, and I don't realize what he's done in his later life. If I'm going to err, I'm going to err on the side of being, generous to the person.
Yeah. I wasn't a huge fan, in general terms, but I thought he produced a number of really fine tracks. I don't know if you caught it, but one track from his last LP, which has been going the rounds, called Lazarus, definitely predicted, was in anticipation of him dying shortly, because obviously with cancer you know that that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And that I found very moving myself, though it might well offend some Christian viewpoints. I mean, starting it with "Look at me, I'm in heaven," for instance, might be considered a little questionable. Christian Post was saying he, quote, experimented with, unquote, Christianity. There was some influence there, but I don't think anybody would have described him as Christian, for instance.
Yeah. Well, right the bat. I haven't heard the tune, the track, but I don't look to musicians for theology, so I'm pretty much I'm pretty much immune to whatever they say. For example, I like John Lennon's song "Imagine" as a song. I think the message is horrible. It's if I break that down as a individual pieces of words and try to analyze them rationally, I pretty much disagree with almost everything in the song. That's not what I go to music for.
Okay. And it isn't really what I go to music for either. So let's move on from there. I came across this item from here, with Tory MPs warning that Sunday schools could be banned from teaching that marriage is between a man and a woman. This sprang from the government deciding that they wanted to send in school inspectors who do try to make all schools in the country stick reasonably to national curriculum here and not introduce things like radicalizing influences. They wanted to send those into, for instance, Islamic madrasas. And the Tory MPs picked up on this and said, this could mean that Sunday schools got taken to task for preaching against same-sex marriage. That's not going to happen because they're just not regarded as the same kind of educational establishment. They're once a week things for short periods, which things like madrasas aren't. They're more intensive tuition.
Okay.
What was your feeling about that? I mean, yes, here the law now defines marriage as not necessarily being between a man and a woman, but perhaps being between two women or two men. No further than that. And here, most people are tolerably happy about it. Therefore, you could see the government not wanting that taught in a mainstream school. How would that play over your side of the Atlantic?
Well, if you're talking about a public school,
Mm-hmm.
that was actually, when you got behind a lot of the debate. I mean, the anti-same-sex marriage crowd was not fairly treated in the press, I thought. And one of the big things was it wasn't so much that two people want to live together, which is often portrayed, but it was the societal effects, such as how would that be presented in public schools and things like that. And so it is a concern. There's no current move for that now, but it is a concern. I know our church had to go through and redo its bylaws because they are afraid of the government and what they might do, and they wanted to make sure they clarified in their bylaws what their teachings were, because our church does not support same-sex marriage. So I know here we've had some cases of florists and people who bake cakes for weddings and photographers have been basically fined hundreds of thousands of dollars because they didn't want to participate in a same-sex wedding. So it's like the tolerance that the other side demands only cuts one way. They want tolerance for their views, but they don't want tolerance for anyone who disagrees. And there's also been rumblings about how this is going to affect colleges, Christian colleges, who some of the students here go on various government grants and things like that. Would they still be allowed to go to a college whose theology didn't accept same-sex marriage? So my view is that I would draw the line at violence personally. If somebody is teaching violence, that's for me a good, nice, clear line, and I like good, clear lines. Beyond violence, however, if you just have a different point of view, that's a different point of view. In my view, the best way to counteract bad ideas is good ideas presented rationally and in a good argumentative, and I mean more of a logical argument and not angry argumentative, but in a good argumentative format is the best way to counter those.
Sure. How about the issue with madrasas in that case? Because there obviously is a concern there that you might be getting a radical form of Islam taught.
Again, I think the best thing to do, and I think this is to where I think we can, by not referring to radical Islam as a form of Islam. I don't mean, when I say radical Islam, I don't mean every Muslim is radical. It's what I use the adjective in the front for. But I think if we were to refer to radical Islam and then highlight those places, I think we can leverage the vast majority, and I think it is a majority, of Muslims who are not radicalized to counteract that. And that's one of the things that's so depressing to me in this whole debate is, we see these huge protests around the world over cartoons in Paris or over the slightest provocation, even things that are false. There was a false rumor that at Guantanamo they were flushing, Quran down the toilet without actually thinking about the mechanics of how that would actually even possibly work. It was a false story, but there were riots around the world, and I think something like 10 or 20 people died in these riots.
Yeah.
But yet, when someone claims to kill in the name of Allah, nothing, we hear very a peep. And in fact, even if we point that out, then the person that points it out is accused of being somehow anti-Islamic. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to not ban the teaching, again, unless now if they're directly teaching violence, that's another issue. But other than violence, shine the light on it. Let people know this is a place that's teaching radical Islam. Let the other Muslims stand up and argue from their faith and their point of view why that is not true Islam. Mm-hmm. And I think we would have a much better outcome.
I have to admit, that attitude from the government makes me vaguely worry about, for instance, seeing Onward Christian Soldiers or maybe the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Yeah.
Because those might be seen as distinctly militaristic from a Christian point of view. And there are some most unfortunate bits of scripture in various places.
It's not so much the Battle Hymn of the Republic was written during the Civil War, and it was written specifically to encourage Northern soldiers.
Exactly.
So you would, in some respects, you would have a good case there.
Yeah.
But when you look at the words, it's not, it's not saying go out and attack. It was a song for a particular instance, and it has become more spiritualized over the years.
Yes.
And in some respects, rather than ban the song, encourage the spiritualization.
Sure. I mean, it's a very fine song.
Yes.
So I would not want to see it vanishing completely.
One of the most moving ever. They did it may have been with Obama when I think when the Pope visited the White House. I think it was with Obama, and they had the Marine choir group there come and swing, and the rendition of that was just very, very beautiful, and it was especially moving because it was being sung by soldiers.
Yes.
And some of the lines in there are very poignant when they're being sung by a soldier. Sure. But they're lifting up glory and honor and sacrifice, and so it's I get nervous whenever the government wants to start restricting speech. Free speech is very important here. I like I said, my view is you counter bad ideas with good ideas, and you don't need to get into suppression.
Okay, I mean, I get incredibly nervous anytime Christianity is linked with anything other than complete non-violence myself, because that is the way I have found myself forced to think. I wasn't this way 20 years ago, but the more I study the Gospels, the more I feel I really cannot find a way to be military and Christian at the same time. And
well, then you may take a view of Onward Christian Soldiers the way I take a view of John Lennon's Imagine.
Could well be. Could well. That is also a very fine tune. Just a shame about some of the words, I think. Okay. And I also saw, as a sort of link with the Sunday school issue, this article by David Henson talking about saving Sunday school by returning to some of its roots, and that would that would be historically right in terms of some of what Sunday schools used to do in this country, and I'm pretty sure in the States too. Um, there are other things that I have slight concerns about with Sunday schools, and I don't know whether I've mentioned it to you previously, but after about 5 years of Sunday school, my upbringing turned me into an evangelical atheist. So I have slight misgivings about whether Sunday school ought to be taught in anything like the way I grew up with. So it's vaguely attractive to see the possibility of it giving educational opportunities that aren't otherwise widely available. What's your thinking on this?
Well, I know a lot of churches here are dropping Sunday school. I teach Sunday school,
Uh-huh.
and so I think myself, it's some of the. I mean, it's a very very complex issue. On the one hand, we have a lot of cultural forces with YouTube, social media, where Twitter, where we want everything in small little bites that actually don't challenge us very much,
Yes.
and where we react to things rather than think things through.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the themes of my Bible study classes is digging deeper, and so we go verse by verse, and it'll take us. We're in Daniel. We started Daniel last March or April, and now we take the summer off here in Wisconsin because it's so short. We want to experience as much of it as we can. So we go down to just one Sunday service and no Sunday school. But we pick back up in the fall, and we're currently in chapter 6. So, it'll probably take me another couple months to finish the book of Daniel. So we go through very, very slowly, very patiently, and we really seek to understand a book. I know some respects, some Sunday school, it's a characterization, but there's oftentimes truth in a lot of these characterizations. At Sunday school is a lot of people getting around and saying, well, what do you think that verse means? And without any, actual work behind it. I know my Sunday school takes me hours of preparation outside for 1 hour of, what I do or 40 minutes of what I do inside.
Yes.
So I think part of it is the culture, part of it is the teaching, part of it's the materials, where you get a book and you fill out some stuff. And, I think it's, just a lot of various different factors going into it, that people want to come in Sunday morning, they want to get their, their Twitter sermon, and then they want to go back out real quick. So.
Do you feel there are these gaps in publicly provided education in the States which there might be call for a church to fill? Because most churches I know and like do some social gospel work. For instance, food banks, sometimes around housing, sometimes around recovery communities, that kind of thing. Nowhere I know at the moment seems to be looking at supplementing education. Do you think that's a possible lack? Because I do see there are areas where we have a very packed national curriculum here, and there's been worry, for instance, that music is falling by the way because it's not seen as particularly useful. And I suspect art similarly is not seen as particularly useful. Would you see a church stepping in to fill those roles at all?
Well, and one of the dynamics that's going on in this country is we have the public education system, but the public education system is quite frankly bad and getting worse.
Yeah.
And I mean, for example, I think it was in New York or one of the northeastern states. They were praising how they were up to 80% graduation rate, and yet they also were only having 10% of their students who actually could do any work, who were ready for college, for example. California just passed a law basically saying that you're still required to take the graduation test to assume that you have reached at least a minimal level of education to graduate, but you don't actually have to pass it any longer. So you no longer, so it's like our schools are churning out people who know less and less. And, so that's why we have a very, very vibrant public or private school system. What would be public schools for your country? And what's really growing in this country, because so many people can't afford public schools, is we have a very thriving homeschooling movement.
Yes.
Where people are just giving up on the public system altogether and they're homeschooling. What you find with the homeschoolers is they are studying things like art and music, and they're still doing enough time for math and everything else. I think part of this also goes to the idea that we've moved away from a classical education, what's derisively called dead white men, dead white men. And so they don't want to teach much art. They don't want to teach much music. They don't want to teach any ancient literature, because to do so, I mean, the reason those were taught was because they instilled the values of Western society into the culture. And quite frankly, much of the ruling elite doesn't like Western culture any longer. So they want to skip away from that. And, that's why we have this move for diversity and all these other issues going on. So we're learning about, tribes in West Africa, or, people in Micronesia, but we're not learning about the people that actually shaped and formed the society in which we live in.
A problem which I think I've seen here too, there's been a tendency over the last 20 years or so, for instance, for the history that's taught in schools to be entirely modern history. And certainly anything going back beyond the 19th century has basically slipped out of most of the teaching. Bearing in mind that we have really rather a lot of history before that. I know it could be argued that the United States doesn't, but there's an awful lot that made this country that happened before 1750. Indeed, some of the most important formative factors date from before that, and I'm wondering if that's really the same thing as you're talking about avoiding dead white men.
I think, well, that's not something I came up with. It's actually very explicit in this country, where there has been a move away from, one of our political leaders, Jesse Jackson, one of his more famous chants is, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. And there has been a very open and deliberate move to get rid of Western civilization as something that needs to be taught, because we need to have multiculturalism and diversity, and which, ends up people don't know much about anything, because they have no context or frame in which to put it. So we are graduating, kids out of college or high school who can't write, and kids out of college who can't think. But in certain fields like computer science and stuff, they can write programs, but they really don't know how to think rationally and to apply critical thinking skills. And in fact, as someone who's taught critical thinking, what oftentimes passes for critical thinking is basically a form of relativism that says thinking is irrelevant. So to sort of make up your own mind as you go along. So I find the same thing in in ethics classes. I was teaching a business class, and the ethics textbook was the ethics chapter was just downright horrible. And I ended basically, when I taught the class, I tossed it out and brought in more traditional ethics teaching to give students. I mean, they're still making the decisions and thinking what it is, but at least they give them the tools to think about how to approach an ethical problem. This textbook didn't really have. I mean, I can get into the details, but we don't really have time for that. But this textbook left someone completely bewildered as to how to actually think ethically.
Difficult. There's a whole subject there that I think I'll flag up for another occasion as to what goes into creating a society and to what extent we need that. But I think we could spend an hour on that all by itself. And I notice that we're at the halfway point at the moment.
Okay.
Which is traditionally time for us to talk about what we do and books and the like. And I am commissioned to mention that we have the showcase associated with the webcast this week, which has a number of items, which includes 2 books by you. So I am a mere editor for Energian at the moment. I'm Chris Eyre. I'm from the UK. I edit for Energian, and you are.
I am Elgin Hushbeck, and I am from Wausau, Wisconsin, so the Midwest. Although I'm an Air Force brat who happened to actually be born in the UK, but spent almost all of my life in the United States, and living all across the United States. And I'm the author of 2 books, actually 4 books. I don't know which 2 my publisher put up this time, but I've written Evidence for the Bible, Christianity and Secularism, Preserving Democracy, and then What is Wrong with Social Justice.
Excellent. And I think next week, both of us will also have posts up on the Energian Discussion Network.
Yep.
Neither
on
of
capitalism.
Weren't you due to be on one of Henry's hangouts in the near future as well?
I was on the last 2,
yes. So we should publicize those as well, which are still available to watch.
Yeah, and maybe this week, I don't know. Usually Henry calls me at the last minute and says, "Oh, by the way."
Sound stuff. Okay, the longer item was one that you suggested. How do we deal with problems on our team? Would you like to expand on that a bit?
Yeah, I think it's one of the things I've been noticing for quite a while now, and different people approach this problem differently. But we're all a part of groups. We have identities. We're Christians. You and I, at least, are Christians. We are members of political parties within our countries. We have all these various groups, and people are sinful people. They do not always live up to our ideas, and at times, people do things that we would not necessarily approve of. And there seems to be, so when I use the term team, I'm using the term in terms of part of our group, part of a group that we identify with. Mm-hmm. And there seems to be 2 main responses to this. One is just to deny it, to my team, right or wrong, the accusations. And you see this, with currently with Hillary Clinton, or the Clintons in general, who are just long trains of well, shall we put it as just scandal. Personally, I think I think it's actually pretty clear she's going to be indicted unless there's political intervention by the White House. But that is a non-issue, and she is still the leading candidate within the Democratic Party, and nothing seems to ever affect it. The idea that she might be indicted doesn't seem to even register. And
Mhm.
on the other hand, you have the Republican approach on their side, which is when somebody does something, well, they weren't really a Republican, or they were a rhino, which stands for Republican in name only, and therefore they weren't really one of us. And this isn't, while it's very visible in politics, and the two different approaches are visible in politics, you can see this in virtually all groups. You see it in Christians,
Yes.
where, for example, you bring up with some Christians, well, what about the Inquisition? How do you deal with that? And the immediate response is, well, they weren't really Christian, so I don't have to deal with it. And on the other hand, so you see this throughout various groups, and my focus isn't really on the politics or the Christianity, but in terms of when we have somebody within our group that does not live up to our potentials, why is it that we seem either to just flat out deny it, or that we immediately cast them out as if they're not part of our group? So that's kind of the core question that I'm raising.
Okay, I sort of tentatively suggest that while we live in a much, much more individualistic age than most in the past, we feel a sense of communal responsibility when somebody that we can be identified with does something wrong or is criticized. I know I for many years had major problems with some of the history of Christianity, which I really did not want to be associated with.
It would be a lot easier.
Absolutely. I suppose there are strains of Christianity which are more or less immune from that, but relatively few of them, and even those they share the rootstock, they share the scriptures, and
yeah,
you have to wonder, oh my goodness. I mean, I frankly feel when there's criticism which is very popular these days, particularly over here, there's criticism of the record of the British Empire. And I feel actually, maybe it had some points to it, and I'm feeling that I'm being criticized for being British because of something some Wally did 250 years ago elsewhere, who also happened to be British and was employed by a previous government which would not be recognised by any of the current political parties as being, there is something emotional there.
Yeah, and I think you see this that's kind of almost the flip side of what I'm talking about, because when it's somebody, when we're on the inside and we're looking at somebody who's done somebody bad, we want, either we deny it or we push them out of the group. People on the outside that are seeking to criticize us, that's all they see is the bad.
Yes.
And they don't look at the big picture. And I think particularly, judging people in history or looking back in history, I think one of the hardest things to do is not to judge them by modern standards. Mm-hmm. And so, you look at some of the things that Christians did, like in the Crusades, right? They did things, that were clearly horrible no matter what. I mean, but on the other hand, they did things which today we would consider horrible, but within their time frame was not. For example, I heard a lecture on the Crusades, and the person doing the lecture commented that the Crusades had taken over a particular city, and the writer who was part of the Crusades, who was writing about this, commended the the Crusaders because they did not violate a single woman, right? So they took over the city and not a single woman was violated. They went on to kill all the women and children in the city, and everybody who was there, but they didn't violate anybody, at least sexually. And he saw that as a good thing. And of course, the modern person looking at that is just horrified. But in the context of the day and the political environment in which they lived, if a city surrendered, then you were not to violate anything. They were basically, you come in, take over, and you don't do anything other than set up your own administration. However, if the city resisted and you had to forcibly storm the city, then you were under the laws of war of those days. You were allowed to basically take retribution out on the city for making you having to storm it. Mm-hmm. That was part of the considerations that then maybe people who weren't going to be able to hold out would just submit without having that happen.
Yeah.
Now today we wouldn't accept those rules, but that was the rules in which the Crusaders lived. That was the norm by which they thought they were supposed to act. And so I'm a little reluctant, and I'm not exactly sure how to judge them. And I just take it that that's what they did in terms of, because they were living by the rules of the societies in which they lived, which was far beyond just Christian.
Yes.
So we have a lot of these problems that we deal with in terms of looking at this. For me, I look at the British Empire, and for me, I look at it on balance.
Yeah.
Did it do things that were bad? Yes.
Oh, yes.
You can go to Winston Churchill for that. Winston Churchill, one of his early speeches, stood up for the rights of the indigenous people during a massacre, and because the rest of the Parliament was going to be our side, right or wrong, and Churchill spoke against that and basically won over the Parliament on that particular issue. Some event that had taken place in India, mm-hmm. And on the other hand, so these are very complex issues. And I think one of my theories, and we bounce it off you and see what you think. I think the reason they were so anxious to push people out of our group or to deny that people in our group are bad is exactly what you said, that we tend to internalize that ourselves and take it upon ourselves. And that reminds us of our sinful nature. I mean, I would take that one step further, saying, and that reminds us of our sinful nature. And therefore, by keeping our group pure, we can somehow say, and see, I'm a member of a good group, therefore I must be a good person.
Yeah.
And I think that's a dynamic that plays into it.
Now, certainly if there's a problem with this person, I am like this person in some way, therefore is there a problem with me, is very uncomfortable thinking.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel huge sympathy occasionally, for instance, for the parents of people who turn into serial killers.
Yeah.
Because they feel responsible every time. I mean, parents feel responsible for an awful lot, which is actually not their responsibility. It's the nature of the job.
Having been a parent, there's some things you can control, and there's some things that
absolutely not. I mean, there are Muslim families in this country who are utterly astonished that their son's gone off to Syria to become a jihadi and is going around lopping off people's heads for not being good enough Muslims.
Yep.
And it's inconceivable to them, but in their case, they're the parents. But I think we feel an element of that with any group that we're closely identified with. I certainly find these days that I find it difficult sometimes talking with people from the States because of the fact that liberal in the States has a tendency to be a term of abuse. It's the name of my original political party, which admittedly merged with another, so it became the Liberal Democrats. But it's never had quite the same name, and I get a stereotype of what liberal is, which just doesn't bear much resemblance to what I've always understood it to be. And I don't have another label to label myself by.
Yeah.
It's a bit difficult to find another label other than liberal Christian to label myself in Christian terms, and that gets a certain amount of flack too.
And yeah, and partially because the term is so misunderstood here. Because you get political parties that get involved as well, and so there's a tendency for the Democrats to be the Democratic Party to be the liberals and the conservatives to be on the Republican, but that's not by any means universal. And then add another factor that enters into this, which is sort of American history, is that up until the 60s, up until about 1968, the Democratic Party was composed of two big groups. One would be the liberals, and the other would be the leftists.
Right.
And the dividing line in those days was pretty clear because the liberals were against the Soviet Union, and the leftists were in favor of the Soviet Union.
Okay.
John F. Kennedy was a liberal, and he was very anti-communist. What happened between 1968, which is probably one of the more tumultuous years in American history, and 1972, is that the Democratic Party went through a major revolution internally, such that the liberals were basically thrown out, left, whatever, but they ceased to be in the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party became totally leftist.
Oh.
However, the term liberal remained. So, because the liberals, quite frankly, they're often referred to as neocons. Pejoratively, that is an anti-Semitic reference, but in general terms, it is used to refer to people who used to be Democrats but have now come over and become Republicans. One of those, for example, was a guy named Ronald Reagan.
Yes. Indeed.
Ronald Reagan was a liberal Democrat, but as he put it, the party left him when it became leftist, and he moved over and became a Republican. So that thoroughly compounds and confuses everything in terms of where a lot of the political parties today. The Democratic Party is, if anything, they're just leftists. But they oftentimes get the label of socialist or liberal or other various things, when in reality, they're leftists is probably the best term for them, but it's also probably the least used.
And that would be by US standards.
Yes.
Because mostly what the Democrats actually do over there doesn't look very leftist, certainly by the standards that we'd have seen in this country 30, 40 years ago, where our left were most definitely closet communists, and the question was, were they Stalinist, were they Maoist, were they Trotskyist?
Yeah.
It wasn't really anything even vaguely to the right of there.
Oh, we do have a presidential candidate who took his honeymoon in the Soviet Union.
Okay.
That would be Bernie Sanders.
Fine. I mean, I have no problem with that. I traveled to an Eastern Bloc country before all this marvelous collapse of walls and collapse of systems happened, I have to say that I felt extremely uncomfortable there, and it was a very brief trip. But you know, why not travel to there if you want to find out what is actually happening?
No, I don't think anybody. I have no problem with them traveling. I know lots of people who have traveled to the Soviet Union. I do have a little question about is that's my first choice for a honeymoon spot, but
Probably in those days, there might have been a slight financial consideration, because I suspect it was hugely cheap.
I actually haven't heard why he made that choice.
No,
Me,
I
I was married roughly the same time. I picked Palm Springs.
Okay. I had my honeymoon in the Yorkshire Dales, which is a whole 35 miles from home. So
That's about the distance from my house to Palm Springs in those days.
fine. So yeah. So how do we
As Christians,
deal with this tendency? I mean, we all have it, I think.
my question I was going to ask was pretty close to the same. What as Christians should we do when we see someone within our group? How do we? And let's assume it's not an interpersonal situation where we can follow the instructions in Matthew and go and talk to the person. But if we see someone in our group, how do we deal with them? And you see this going on with, for example, the Republican Party is currently struggling how to deal with this with Donald Trump.
Yes.
But which personally, I'll go on record. I don't think he will be the nominee. So I would be concerned. If it came down to Trump and Clinton, there would be no question in my mind I'd pick Trump because I believe Clinton to be a criminal and corrupt. And I'll take Trump over corrupt. I don't think Trump is corrupt. I think he's a lot of things, but not corrupt. If it came down to Bernie Sanders and Trump, yeah.
That's a difficult one for you. Yes.
Yes.
Admittedly, I'd take Bernie Sanders over any of the other candidates I've heard of, but I'm from
I expect that from you.
Yeah, I'm from a significantly left country to start off with, and I think we need to look to ourselves why we are feeling targeted and find out whether there is any justification in our feeling that it is us that are targeted rather than it being one aberrant person.
Yeah. I think we have on our side, I would, and this is what I try to do is, I criticize the people for their actions. So for example, the Inquisition, I criticize the Inquisition for being widely off the mark in terms of Christian values, and in no way speaks to Christianity. But I have to own up; those were Christians, right? I mean, I don't know personally their relationship to God, but I can't, in all honesty, say I know that they were not Christians just because they didn't act in a way that I would not approve of. We have I think it's the Westboro Baptist Church is going out and protesting at military funerals. I would love to say that they were not Christian. I would love to be able to say they were some other religion, but to me that just means it's my duty to stand up and criticize them and who they are. And I think this is the same thing. This is going back to the earlier discussion. This is the thing that disappoints me so much about Islam. And where is the criticism of the people within your group that are doing horrendous things and combating them. And I think I think one of the reasons you don't see, and one of the nice things about the West Barrel Baptist Church is that they're so small and they are so fringe that that's about it. I mean, there's a few stray people with that type of attitude, but it's not in any sense of the mainstream. And I think that's because they are so thoroughly condemned. And yet, I like I said, I wish I could say they weren't, but they are part of the group.
I wish I could say the same thing. I mean, there are also some televangelists with really quite large followings whose words I look at, and the extent to which they're cringeworthy from my point of view is just incredible. But they are Christians. I have to admit that they are Christians of a sort. And that's something that I have to deal with. And mostly I deal with it by looking at myself and thinking, am I guilty of any of the same things as them?
Yeah.
Ruthlessly remove it if so.
Well, I think that's a good thing because it helps us it's a point of self-evaluation.
Yeah.
And our understanding of Scripture should have an impact on our life. And to me, that's as a teacher, one of the things that hits me so much is that I'm held according to the Bible, I'm held to a much higher standard because I teach the Word, and which is one of the reasons I spend many hours outside of Sunday school class, if I'm going to teach.
Yes.
Because of that standard. And so I go back and I look at, well, how did they get to where they are? Mm-hmm. How do they get that belief, and what in Scripture leads them to that? And, am I guilty of that similar type of error? So it's a condemnation on them, and then a source of an opportunity for reflection and self-correction on my part.
Indeed, so. The Muslim circles that I am to some extent associated with all condemn the radical jihadis, left, right, and centre, all the time, except for one guy who I met, not in a discussing religion sense, but just socially some time ago, and I ended up doing a bit of legal work for him. And he's not a particularly thinking Muslim. He's a cultural Muslim, and he is very, very reluctant to condemn them absolutely. And it is, I think, in his case, entirely because he feels this criticism of them has to be somehow criticism of me, and it's just too uncomfortable, and I can't do it, and I'm not showing solidarity with my co-religionists. I can't persuade him to be more critical of his own position on that. Apart from anything else, he doesn't actually know enough about the religion to engage. But I can also understand the Muslims who don't stand up and be counted in terms of criticism, because I am feeling the same kind of pressures as they are, and they're but for the grace of God.
Yeah, although I would like to see the internal voices, like Sisi in Egypt gave a major speech saying Islam has got to reform and move into the modern era. Mm-hmm. I'm disappointed that we aren't backing him more, that we aren't taking that as an opportunity to help Islam, the moderate forces within Islam suppress the more radical forms. On the other hand, I think there's such a political correctness about it. I mean, take, for example, the recent shooting. We had the Planned Parenthood shooting, And within hours, there were people saying, and I'm not talking about just random things on the internet. There are major political figures and major social figures talking about how Christianity, you had the one blog about how evangelicals need to clean up their house and be careful what they're doing. Turned out the guy was not really a Christian. He was just a nut. He was mentally imbalanced.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then a couple weeks later, or a week later, we had the incident in San Bernardino, Redlands, which is actually my old hometown. And we went for a week. Well, no, we can't say that's Muslim, and we don't really know. And there's all this ambiguity and a very reluctance to actually say what it was. And to me, that, I think we rushed the gun on Planned Parenthood shooting, and we're way too late. In fact, even now, people will say, well, that is not. We had the shooting of a police officer in Philadelphia. I don't know if you heard about it.
I haven't, no.
Yeah, well, a man, Islamic ISIS person, walked up to a police car and opened fire and shot a police officer 3 times. He shot an entire clip of a pistol, hit the police officer 3 times, and then ran off. The police officer was not killed, luckily, and was still able to chase after him and bring him into custody. But he admitted it's ISIS, and he confessed to the police it's ISIS. And the police chief, when announcing that he confessed it was ISIS, then went into a big, long thing saying, but don't ever confuse this for Islam. This is not Islam. We all know that Islam would never do such a thing.
Yes.
It's not our police chief's job to pronounce on what is and is not Islamic teaching.
True.
So I think there's an imbalance there.
There might be. Hey, we didn't ask the Catholics to apologize for the IRA, so I don't know.
The IRA or the IRS?
On that note, I think as we're slightly over time, I'll call it a day, and have a good week, everybody, and tune in next week.
All right, goodbye.
Goodbye.